Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, we go all the way back to 2017, May of 2017 to be specific, to the Pedalshift Project 079, talking about the Eastern Express route. And this is a big shout out to the Adventure Cycling Association for giving me the inspiration for this particular best of. They gave our interview subject, Frank Moritz, a shout out for his invention of the current Eastern Express connector, formerly the Eastern Express route, that he literally invented through research and experience. Dude's an absolute legend, and this conversation was right after he launched it. And we had a great discussion about creating the route, why it was an improvement to basically the entire eastern section of the Transamerica route, and much, much more. This route includes the C&O, the GAP, and a whole lot. The Katy Trail, lots of rides that listeners are really familiar with based on the rides that I've done in the past. But great discussion. I invite you to take a look at Adventure Cycling Association's Eastern Express Connector, which is the new version of this. I am unsure if the website that I mentioned is still active. I know Frank was going to be retiring that at some point, so the references to that may or may not still exist. But the route lives on thanks to the Adventure Cycling Association and the adoption of the Eastern Express Connector. This discussion, however, lives on here on the pod. Hope you enjoy. Frank Moritz is a veteran adventure cycling tour leader, instructor, and board member, and has completed the initial research to create the Eastern Express addition to the legendary Transamerica bike route. This new route provides a welcome option for Trans Am cyclists to bypass the severe mountain climbs and nasty dogs that confront cyclists in southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southern Missouri on the eastern half of the existing route. It also replaces 3 major high-altitude climbs in Colorado with 1 gradual and scenic climb to the Continental Divide. Amazingly, almost 600 of the 2,100 plus miles of this route are on dedicated bike and pedestrian paths, tow paths, or rail trails. So, without further ado, here comes Frank. I'm pleased to have Frank Moritz here joining us on the Pedalshift project. Hello, Frank. How are you?
I'm fine. Good to talk to you, Tim.
It's fantastic to talk to you. I am speaking with the originator, the creator, the inventor, if you will, of the Eastern Express route, which you can find at easternexpressroute.com. And Frank, I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of your background in bicycle touring, because you have a rich history. You've worked with the Adventure Cycling Association, and you've done a lot of riding yourself. So share what you'd like with our listeners about what your background is.
Yeah, as far as bicycling, I started back in the D.C. area, lived in Bethesda in D.C., and I started bicycling back there with the Potomac Peddlers, and also occasionally commuted to work by bike. Retired from my job in 97, moved out to Colorado, and since then, well, at least 15 years after, I was a bike tour leader for both Adventure Cycling Association and for a Denver-based company called Timberline Adventures. I was also a leader instructor for adventure cycling, and I served on their board of directors. So I'm pretty heavily invested in bicycle travel.
Before we get into the whole Eastern Express route, I'm curious about the background as a member of the board of directors of Adventure Cycling Association, because obviously it has such a prominent role in bicycle touring here in the United States. What were the types of things that you would do in that role? I assume that it had a very strategic kind of vision for all of this. I'm curious, if to the extent you're able to share that, of course, what was that kind of like, and how did your role fit into all of that?
Well, like any board of directors, you provide governance for the organization, and Adventure Cycling has now grown to nearly 50,000 members, which is pretty impressive. I think it's the largest bicycle travel organization in the United States, if not the world. The role of the board was to make sure that the vision and mission was staying pretty consistent, especially with what the members wanted. And the idea basically is that you inspire and you make possible for people to travel by bicycle. They do the inspiration through a semi-month, no, every other month magazine, probably one of the best bicycling magazines that's out there, called Adventure Cyclist. And their main mission, the thing that probably differentiates them from anyone else, is that since 1976, they have researched and mapped a bicycle route system throughout the United States, including one of the only mountain bike routes, which goes from Alberta, Canada, down to the Mexico border across the continental divide of the U.S. They also have 3 major cross-country routes that go from coast to coast in this country. And it's a major task keeping up that research, in addition to which they take on at least one new bike route development every year. So they are up to several tens of thousands of miles of bicycle routes. And the other mission that they've taken on is that they are the broker working with State Department of Transportations across the country to develop what's called the U.S. Bike Route System, where there will be officially designated and signed bicycle routes that will appear on state road maps. So it's a pretty robust set of organizational principles and activities that they're undertaking. And it's quite a job to make sure that it keeps itself focused on the right targets.
Yeah, absolutely. One of those routes is the Transamerica route. And it's, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the original route across the country. It is kind of the focus of your alternative Eastern Express route. Before we sort of get into what you've created, I'm curious about your thoughts on the Transamerica route, because I think that your point of view on the eastern side of it was what prompted you to create this alternative route. Tell me what you think about the Trans Am route right now.
The original Transamerica route was created by what was then called Bike Centennial, to basically serve as a route for a cross-country ride to celebrate the bicentennial of the U.S. in 1976. And it was researched over a period of 2 years. If you look at it going from east to west, it starts down near Yorktown, Virginia on the east coast, goes down through southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and across the Ohio and Mississippi rivers through southern Missouri into Kansas. Then when it gets to Colorado, it sort of heads north until it gets to Missoula, Montana, and then heads west from there. So it's at the time they were looking for a route that was both bicycling safe as well as scenic and had some historical interest. In 2001, they created what's called the Western Express, and that's a route that's much more direct, going from San Francisco across the Nevada and Utah deserts to come into Pueblo, Colorado. And my thought was, I led their self-contained cross-country trip on the Trans Am for Adventure Cycling in 2007. And it convinced me that all of the feedback we'd been getting from riders for years was true. That is that the segment that goes through southwestern Virginia and Kentucky, basically cutting through the Appalachians and through the Ozarks and southern Missouri, is first of all physically difficult. Both the numbers, the steepness, and the distance of the hills climbed are very rigorous. However, that was the best they could find as far as getting through the Appalachians, back in '76. And the other element that makes it, in my opinion, a little less than inspiring is that, quite frankly, those parts of the country are some of the most economically depressed in the country. And what's happened as a result of basically the impoverishment of those areas is that there are very few support services for a cyclist or for any traveler at all going through that area. There's a large segment of 2 days of riding from the border of Virginia and Kentucky until you get to Boonesboro, Kentucky, that's hanging on the thread of the goodwill of a historical society in Hindman, Kentucky, that basically allows travelers to camp out on their lawn. So I've been concerned with some time, both about the aesthetics of that section of the route, as well as the survival of support systems for people. That's true in general of almost all of our major adventure cycling cross-country routes. One of the things that's happened over the course of the last several decades with the big boxing of American stores is that these small towns that we love to ride through on the back roads have lost all of their support services like grocery stores and campgrounds and that sort of thing because the services have all become concentrated on the interstates and the major U.S. highways, none of which we want to ride on if we can avoid it. So for years, people have been asking adventure cycling, is there any way that you can put together something easier, by which they mean, is there any way to get through the Appalachian Mountains that's different? And what happened probably in the early to mid 2000s, the final piece fell into place that allowed me to do that and to find a new route, which was the opening and completion of the Great Allegheny Passage rail trail, which goes from Cumberland, Maryland to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so several years ago, I started undertaking the research on that. But basically, I termed it the Eastern Express simply because it seemed like a natural counterpart to what already existed as the Western Express. So that's the background.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really detailed vision of it. The thing that you've been saying about Kentucky in particular in that section is something that I've heard as well. We've done some interviews on this show within the last year of folks who've done the Trans Am. And one person that I've spoken to in particular, Michael Risico, is a friend of the show, literally does not want to go through Kentucky anymore because of some of the things that you've said, but also just he's had some bad riding experiences. It's a heavily trucked route as well, and some other things where there's been a degradation of just the riding experience. So I think that the time for the Eastern Express is well timed. So I'm curious how long you talked about this being something that you've researched over the years. How long did it take for you to develop this route? Like, when did you start to? When did your website launch, roughly?
The website launched in December of last year, and I would say I worked on it for 3 to 4 years. It's time consuming, and it's time consuming because as a tour leader, I have a good acquaintance with what's really required to have a safe, scenic, and basically enjoyable ride. And so you can't just draw a straight line from here to there. And it's also something that I could not work on full time. But I had actually spent many years developing routes, shorter routes for rides for adventure cycling. In fact, about over a dozen of the rides that is offered by the Tourist Department of Adventure Cycling were routes that I created. And one of the things you find out as a tour leader is that when you're taking a group of people as opposed to people traveling solo or in twos or threes, is that your logistical and safety requirements are considerably different. And that if you design a route that's adequate to provide both safety and good support for a group of 12 to 15 people, then the route will support just about any size group, and especially for the onesies and twosies who are going to ride on the route. So basically, off and on, I spent the last 3 to 4 years working on it. The one tool that came along, 2 of them actually, that were critical and are really indispensable for anyone who's trying to create even a day ride route, is the bicycle routing mechanism or application within the Google Maps app. And the really big development that came along was the development of a website which has its own bike routing app, and that's called ridewithgps.com. An individual, actually you don't even need to be a member to use their treasure chest of thousands of routes that individuals have created. But as a mapping device, its algorithm is very heavily weighted toward finding the routes between point A and point B that are best for a bicycle. And that's the tool that I use to actually create the paper documents.
Yeah, and what's fantastic about using that as a tool, and Google as well, is in addition to having these fabulous cue sheets, which are, sort of the classic way of being able to route yourself across a country as an independent, unsupported rider, you've also got this into the Ride with GPS app as well. So if someone is a little bit more on the high tech side of things, they can have that all loaded up on their iPhone or their Android phone and be able to ride this route with turn-by-turn directions. So that's a really significant added on, I think, for what you've done as well.
It's very different, very, very much to the point. I'm not a high-tech rider myself, but I know that people do want GPX and some other types of digital files. And, when it's in the treasure chest of Ride with GPS, all that's available. They could even go in and reverse the route if they, up to this point, I've only done the westbound documentation, but they could download or the files from Ride with GPS, and they can simply go in and edit and reverse the route if they wanted. So that's no small thing. One of the really big tools for Google, and actually Ride with GPS as well, is the ability for me or anyone to use the Street View, which is how I actually scouted the route in terms of, traffic, shoulders, safety, scenery, that whole thing. Because I could not get out there on the road as I normally would have done and scouted the route. And so basically I have, in a sense, vicariously ridden the route pretty much all the way using Street View, which is time consuming, but it's very reassuring because I really would have been reluctant to put this thing out there for people without having some sense that I was offering them something safe.
I have to confess, I've done the exact same things when I've done routes, particularly out west, when it's something that I've never been on before, just to visualize it a little bit. It's a really, really helpful tool. So to be able to build a route the way that you have without actually having ridden it and use those street mapping tools, and that Street View tool, that's just fantastic. It's really quite remarkable, actually, I think.
Yes.
I'm curious, it sounds like the advent of the idea here was the completion of the C&O linking with the GAP, which I talk about constantly on the show because, as most people know who listen to the show, I live here in Washington, D.C. as well. I'm curious, did the Katy Trail come into this as well? Because it strikes me that the two big chunks of mileage that are off-road are the Katy Trail and the C&O and GAP. Were you looking at those two things and looking at a way to link them together as a part of this route, or did it just sort of happen automatically as you kept continuing to go west on the route as you were developing it?
It wasn't as magical as it might sound. Once I got the route to the Mississippi River on the banks of Illinois across from Missouri, by happenstance and good luck, the Adventure Cycling Association had already mapped a route, the Lewis and Clark route, that started on the Illinois shore of the Mississippi and actually went through Atchison. So basically the route, and it uses the Katy Trail. So all of that research was done. All I needed to do was to plug in that segment. So basically you're riding the Lewis and Clark bicycle route, which is fully approved and mapped by Adventure Cycling, all the way from Alton, Illinois, or at least the Illinois shore of the Mississippi, to crossing the Missouri River in Atchison, Kansas.
Gotcha. So the idea here was you only reinvented the wheel for the parts that were necessary, and then through the happenstance of arriving at the right part of Illinois, it hooked up with a pre-existing route, so it was able to go from there. Does that sound about right?
That's right. The part of the route between Pittsburgh and the Mississippi River was determined by several things. First of all, there was a nice rail trail west of Pittsburgh that went almost to Steubenville, Ohio, on the Ohio River, called the Panhandle Trail. And from Steubenville across, you're sort of almost automatically having to follow the I-70 corridor, obviously not paralleling it, but what I finally decided, ideally, the typical daily mileage on an adventure cycling trip or on any other tour that I've done is ranges from 60 to 70 miles a day, assuming the terrain's not severe. And so I was looking for ways to have that kind of a sort of daily interval where you could end up someplace where you had both a camping and an indoor overnight lodging option. And it happened that I discovered, when you look at the big map, that the state of Ohio and Indiana both have a nice set of state parks with beautiful facilities that happen to be that distance apart. So then you connect the dots with the back roads.
It's almost like they built it for us, right?
Almost. But it's really nice. The Ohio state parks in particular they have conference lodges and indoor lodging as well as campgrounds. So that works out perfectly, and it keeps you off the interstates.
Do you happen to know, do Ohio and Indiana and those state parks have hiker-biker setups, or is it sort of the more typical car camping setup? Because I know that can matter for in terms of facilities for folks who are on bicycles.
Yeah, there are a couple of places that have either biker-hiker sites or places that are basically what they call carry-in, non-car camping sites. The nice part was that every one of the grounds I found did have showers, which is, the one nice amenity, as you know, that every cyclist likes at the end of the day.
Particularly in the summer.
Especially.
Yeah, it can be humid, and a shower at the end of the day is very good.
Yes.
Frank, I think the best way that I would characterize this route right now is that it feels like it's in what I would call a public beta right now, and that you're looking for people to ride this route and give you comments, and also to have folks who live in the areas around this route to give comments. Is that a characterization that you'd say is correct?
That's absolutely right. I put it out there feeling about 90% confident that the route would work. And what I'm hoping is that by getting feedback from people who ride the route or who live in those areas, that you'll have a route that's really nailed down and is really enjoyable. The one example I can give is that I was unsure about the routing through or around Pittsburgh, which is it's both hilly and it's very traffic intensive. And so I sent an email to the local area bicycling club, and they came back with fabulous ride with GPS files and all sorts of other things, and said, the route that I initially proposed in one segment was sort of a death trap because it's not obvious. And they also provided me with a circular route that you can use if you want to simply bypass Pittsburgh and circle around it on a dedicated rail trail. So, and I've gotten feedback already from a few people who said, hey, I live in this area, and if you take this route instead of that route, you're going to avoid rumble strips and heavy traffic and that sort of thing. So the crowdsourcing mechanism offered by the internet is just invaluable. There are, in addition, at least a dozen people who have told me so far by email that they plan to ride some or all of it this summer, and that they'll be giving me reports back, which is fantastic.
I think that that's a really critical piece. So I want to make sure that everybody who's listening to this, who's interested in writing some of this, knows what they can do to help out with this process. It looks like that going through the website, easternexpressroute.com, you've got a mechanism there for folks to report new ideas or give reports on the riding of the route, things like that. Is that probably the best way folks can help out?
That's correct. And I do try to reply within a day to acknowledge or to engage in a discussion. So it's what's called the blog page. And somewhere on the website is my personal email is also available. And I'm perfectly happy to get emails and have a discussion with people.
And that's how we got in touch. So
indeed.
So thanks for responding to that. I'm curious, do you have any other recommendations that might be different from the sort of quote unquote usual routes out there in the US? Is there something else that catches your eye in the same way as this Eastern Express route?
You mean as in terms of perhaps the next project?
Yeah, the next project, something else that has your eyes. I mean, this is a lot. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is a fantastic amount of work, but I'm curious if there's something else that's caught your eye.
I think my only observation would be what any experienced bike touring or even bike riding person would know is that, finding bicycle appropriate roads is getting harder and harder. Between the fact that most DOTs seem to feel that they have to use their rumble strip machines, regardless of whether it's necessary. The condition of the roads, which haven't been maintained. And the main thing is, as I said, in the rural areas where you'd really love to ride, the small mom and pop stores are going away. The restaurants, the cafes, even the convenience stores in some cases. And it makes it hard. I mean, you can pick out a route, and then when you go and, look at it on Street View or something, you're going for, perhaps a whole day's ride with absolutely nothing in between, including no water stops. So I think that's becoming the big challenge. Small town America is not in good shape, and that means that, the options for really nice rural bicycle riding are just becoming challenging logistically.
Yeah, I hear you on all that. And my hope is that bicycle touring as an economic engine can hopefully help support some of these places and continue to have them be offered in these small towns. I think that that's certainly something that has been studied and looked at. And hopefully we can help that along by continuing to go out and doing these great cross-country rides and helping out wherever we can. I'm buying my candy bar and my Gatorade every few miles on some of these longer days. It's a little bit, but hopefully it helps.
Yeah, one of the specific things that Adventure Cycling, in fact, has done is to take and gather the research on the economic impact of bicycle travel and tourism, and it's pretty impressive. We're not, huge numbers that go through any particular town, but we certainly affect any given region rather substantially.
Yeah, there's no doubt when you look at some of the towns that are well-traveled bicycle routes that there is a huge impact by the riders that are there. So I think it's something that we can at least hang our hat on in terms of economic development and arguments for making sure that roads are built in a way that can accommodate bicycles. So that's my best pitch, at least. So
very good.
Frank, thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much again, easternexpressroute.com. Thanks for building this. Thanks for all the hard work. And I'm hoping that everybody who listens to this, who's anywhere near on the route, can help make this route even better by giving thoughts and ideas as well.
Well, thank you. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net. Lots of great content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his debut album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Habitat, wherever cool music is available.